Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva and I've been doing live streams on various Christian topics. And this particular series is called The Dates of Christianity. And this is part 3, so let's get started. So part 3 is called In the Star and the Magi. Those are all famous, important symbols and things that happened back during the time of Jesus' birth. Just a review from last week. Last week we were talking about the time of year that Jesus was born. And we talked about how you could get information just from the Bible alone, namely the verses 1 Chronicles 24, verses 7 through 19. That gives the schedule for the Levitical priest divisions. That's right, they were called the Levitical priest divisions. And then, of course, from Luke chapter 1, verse 5 and verses 23 and 26, you could wean that and the information contained in those verses just to 2 times in the year that Jesus could have been born. That would have been late March or late September. And then furthermore, you can use Luke chapter 2 to cut that number of possibilities down to just 1, that it would have been late September. Of course, that entirely rules out December 25th, and we talked about how that was chosen to replace 3 different pagan holidays that were around that time, around the early 4th century, and they changed that to be the Christian holiday of Jesus' birth. Okay, so today we're going to talk about some other elements of the Christian story, 3 of them, and see if we can apply some first century Jewish cultural lens and framework to understand them more correctly. So first, let's talk about the inn with no room. Now, that entire story is based on just one obscure verse, which is Luke chapter 2, verse 7. It says, "She gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn." That comes from the Bible version, the NIV 1984. It seems like a long time ago, but that was the version of the Bible that I became a Christian under and read to begin with. Hopefully it's not too old. Now, first you have to consider what is the story that is told nowadays in books and in movies. Typically, the story goes something like this. Mary is in labor. She and Joseph are traveling to Bethlehem and spot an inn, which is just a small public lodging that serves food and drink and housing to temporary housing to travelers. So they approach it, and this mean innkeeper opens the door and tells them there's no room for them, despite her being in labor. And then he directs them to the only possible place that they could go, which is this nearby stable. So they go to the stable, and she gives birth amongst the stable occupants. Typically that's some sheep, cattle, maybe a donkey. And oftentimes in the nativity scene, they also somehow put in some angels, the 3 Magi, and maybe they hang a star down in the nativity scene. So we have several of those around our house. It's always nice to put those out on the mantle. Now, the question with this story is it really what happened, or are we Hollywoodizing it? Now, the first question I wanted to answer myself was, were there even multi-room buildings built for the sole purpose of sheltering travelers during the 1st century? Was there a Motel 7 or a Best Western, as it were? And the answer is there actually were. I was a little surprised. Now, the Greek word for these ancient hotels is pronounced pandocheon, and it literally translates to receives all. Now, it is used in the Bible one time, but not in Luke chapter 2. Instead, it's found in Luke chapter 10, verse 34, and that is in the story of the Good Samaritan. Perhaps you remember that the Good Samaritan buys a place for the person who was beat up and pays for his stay at this inn and tells the innkeeper that he'll pay for any other charges that come up when he returns. So in Luke 7, then, what is the word? If it's not this pandocheon, what is the word that's translated as in a lot of different Bible translations? And it is kataluma. Kataluma. This word refers to the attached guest room of an ancient house. Now, 6 popular but older translations use this word or translate that word as in. That's the NASB, ESV, the older NIV, ASV, AMP, and KJV. Now, there are 3 newer NIV variants that I would say correctly translate the word as guest room. And that would be the NIV WS, TNIV, and NIV NIRV. Now, there's a great book on this whole topic written by Kenneth Bailey, and I put a link to that in the description of this. It's called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, which is very much akin to the purpose of my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. Not just Middle Eastern eyes, but the first century Jewish lens. And he describes ancient Middle Eastern homes. Now, this same word, kataluma, is used in 2 other times in the Gospels. And in both of those places, which those are Mark 14:14 and Luke 22:11, both of those places were when Jesus was telling his disciples what to say when they were trying to secure a room for the Passover. And in both those places, it's not translated as inn. That wouldn't make sense for Jesus to tell his disciples, hey, go find an inn somewhere, and then that's where we're going to hold Passover. No, it's translated as guest room in all the Bible translations. So it is kind of odd that some older Bible translations used inn, and I believe that just had to do with the history of the story that Mary and Joseph went to an inn, and so they translated it as inn. And that's why more modern versions translate it as guest room. It also may not have made sense. I mean, in modern terms, you would probably say, now Mary and Joseph were traveling to Bethlehem and she was in labor, so they went to a hospital. That's probably what we would use nowadays. But would they just go to some random person's house? That wouldn't make sense either. So perhaps that's another reason why they use this term inn. It's not a hospital. They didn't really have hospitals back then, but at least it's not a random person's house. But you have to remember that Joseph is from Bethlehem because this is his family's ancestral land, and that is why he and Mary were traveling there in the first place, because of the census, and that's in verse 4 of chapter 2. What really happened? Now let me put up a slide here. So here's what I think really happened. Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem because of the census, and because that's where he was, and that's where his ancestral land was. And that is where you had to register the census from there, because that is where you own land. And in other nations besides Jerusalem, that wasn't the case, and that's why historians don't typically refer to people having to go somewhere for a census. But in the case of the Jews, they did have to go somewhere because they often didn't live where the land that they owned, their ancestral land, was. Mary and Joseph go to a relative's home there. And there are other relatives already there for the census. So it's a little bit crowded. And there's no room where they would normally put guests, which is in this attached guest room. So instead they stay in the main family room. Now, if you look at this image that I have up here, so this is how a lot of these ancient Middle Eastern homes were built. So you had this, first of all, they were very small compared to our houses. Probably have already thought about that, but they would have this main room, which was the family living area, and then they would have this guest room, this kataluma, that's what that is. And it would most likely have its own entrance. Now, what was unusual, at least to our modern ears, about this living area is that it also had this stable area where animals were kept. And right up on this ledge, of course, this area was lower, and this meant that the cattle, the sheep, the lambs could not just go up into the family living area. They would remain down in this lower stable area. But then there would also be these two carved out formations, for lack of a better word, that they could put hay in, and those were the mangers. So it doesn't say in the scriptures here in Luke that that Mary was already in labor, and so when they got there, the first thing they did is she had the baby. It just says while they were there. So while they were there, the time came for Jesus to be born, and you can see from that this image, by the way, is an image that I drew, but it's from the information and descriptions that are provided in Kenneth Bailey's book. Now, it's very strange for us to see a stable in the house. We wouldn't dream of doing it this way in modern times, most likely because the inconvenience of the smell and the sounds of the cattle lowing and mooing. But back then, it had several big advantages which overcame any of those detriments. First of all, the animals were natural heaters. So whereas nowadays we have forced air or fireplaces, they didn't have that. And so these animals would be natural heaters, the heat that was given off from the animals' bodies. The animals themselves would also benefit from being protected indoors, and they would also be safe from thieves, which was a very common problem back then. And as I mentioned, the mangers were simply carved out bowl-shaped areas where they could place hay. Now, why would they put Jesus there? Well, because it ends up being a natural bassinet, and I doubt that Joseph and Mary were the first person to ever do this. It probably was, I don't know if I would use the word common, but it was probably something that was done because it was just a natural bassinet. The baby wouldn't roll out of it. And I assume there would be a way to get the animals to eat food out of the other manger, or mangers, and not bother the infant. And Joseph and Mary, because this was a relative, and because they were here in Bethlehem at this time when they now had a newborn baby, they stayed there for a time. We don't know how long, but perhaps it was several weeks. So that is what I think is the true story of Jesus and the Mary and Joseph and Jesus' birth. It's still, if you think about it from God's viewpoint, going from being God in heaven and coming down to earth, no matter where you went, even if he was born in the king's palace in this beautiful room, that would still be quite the downward shift, quite the lowly, humble birth. But he was born what I would say is a more normal birth for those times. So there's no reason for us to make it any worse or any more lowly than it already was. God was definitely humbling himself because of his love for us. Okay, so now let's talk about the Star of Bethlehem and the Magi. So this story about the star and the Magi, they appear together and only in one place in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Now, the Greek word for Magi is magos, and it just means magi or sorcerer. Now, it's traditionally been interpreted or translated as wise men, and there's some reason for that, I would say. Now, another place where this word is used is in Acts chapter 2, it's actually Acts chapter 8. Let me change that while I'm thinking about it. Acts chapter 8, verse 9. This is about this guy that we call Simon the sorcerer. It says there was a man named Simon. He practiced sorcery, which is maguo, and that's that verb form of magos. Magi are often associated with a priestly class of individuals. This is where you get these wise men. So maybe think of wise as like scholars or priests or teachers. Priestly class of individuals from Persia and Arabia called the Zoroastrians. And they were known for their expertise in astrology, astronomy, and dream interpretation. I should say that this story seems out of place for the Bible and for the book of Matthew. Matthew is the gospel, which is aimed primarily at a Jewish audience. So here you have Matthew talking to a Jewish audience about these Gentiles who came from some other country and who recognized the birth of the King of the Jews, and they traveled from afar to visit him. And Luke, which was written to the Gentile audience, he doesn't mention it at all. It is very odd. But, again, it's these things that stick out. That's where the meat of gospel stories and God's story can be found. Now, the reason why it's in Matthew is, first of all, because it actually happened. We don't know all the different events that happened around Jesus, but we do know what is written in the Bible. And so we know that this actually happened. Now, I believe that Matthew put it in his gospel because it emphasizes Jesus being born in Bethlehem, which is a fulfillment of Micah chapter 5, verse 2. That verse says, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." It also gives a reason for why Joseph and Mary had to escape to Egypt and then return to Judea. Again, I'm not saying that Matthew made this up as part of a story. It didn't really happen. No, all this happened, but Matthew used it as a device, included these bits in the story of his narrative of the gospel, so that he could also talk about these prophecies that were fulfilled. And Matthew has the most references in the Bible where it says something like, "This was to fulfill the prophecy such and such." So in this case, Joseph and Mary is coming from Egypt back to Judea. That fulfills Hosea 11:1. It says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Another reason why I think this is in there, and why it would have been important for the Jews to read this and see this, is that Jesus was not just for the Jews. He was a universal leader. And that fulfills Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 3, which we talked about at length in the Kingdom series. It says, "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob.'" So that prophecy talks about how people would come from outside of Jerusalem because of the start of the kingdom in this case, but we know from that study that the start of the kingdom and the birth of Jesus are interrelated. Now, going back to the star, that's also a very interesting part of the story. Its first purpose was to awaken the Magi to the birth of the King of the Jews. It says we saw his star in the sky. It doesn't say we saw it in the east, but because they were to the east, and it wouldn't make sense for the star to be in the east. That would make them go further east. So they would have seen a star in their west, and that would have told them to go west. And it got them to as far as Jerusalem at first. And it's there where they meet Herod, and they tell them that we saw this sign in the sky that the King of the Jews has been born. We want to go see him and worship him. And so Herod gets very intrigued, to say the least, because he doesn't want another king to come around. He's the king. So he consults with the Israel's teachers and scholars, and they find this scripture that I just read in Micah chapter 5 verse 2. So they say, well, he's got to be in Bethlehem. So they sent the Magi on their way to Bethlehem. Now it's at this part of the story that the star is now able to direct the Magi not just to Bethlehem, which is about 90 miles from Jerusalem, but it was also able to direct them straight to this house where Jesus was staying. Again, it wasn't an inn that they were still at after giving birth, but it was at a house, most likely the house of a relative. Now, going back to the tying the Magi and the star together, these Zoroastrians did have a prophecy of a savior figure called the Saoshyant, who was expected to bring about the triumph of good and evil over evil, and that he would resurrect the dead, and that he would be born of a virgin. So that's very interesting. This is found in their book called the Zend Avesta, in the chapter called Yasht. And in chapters 13 and 30, I'm not familiar with that book, but I was able to find these references online. This would explain how the Magi knew to look for this sign, and then why it would be so important for them to travel all this way from the east to Jerusalem and then to Bethlehem. Now the Jewish priests and teachers, that was from Matthew 2 verse 4. Remember, they got together and tried to figure out where the Messiah was supposed to be born given the prophecies. They may have also connected the star to a different prophecy. This time it's in the Bible, but it's from a non-Israelite, and his name was Balaam. Now Balaam was from Syria, and that would mean that his prophecies would have been known outside of Israel. It wouldn't have just occurred in the Hebrew Bible, but it would have occurred in whatever other writings they had in Syria, and maybe even this book, the Zend Avesta. Who knows? Now, in Numbers 24 is where these prophecies of Balaam are recorded. In verse 1 it says, "Now when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not resort to divination as at other times, but turned his face toward the wilderness. When Balaam looked out and saw Israel encamped tribe by tribe, the Spirit of God came on him, and he spoke his message." And he says several different things. But then down in verse 17, it says, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel." So whatever this star was, I don't think it was some sort of conjunction of planets or a supernova, which is what astronomers like to ascribe it to. I'm sure there were such conjunctions, but those occur fairly regularly. Supernova are more rare, but they don't lead people to somebody's house. They just appear in the sky somewhere. So I don't think it was any sort of astronomical event. I think it was supernatural. I think it was a sign that God provided in the sky. It doesn't mention anybody else seeing it, but the Magi sure saw it and followed it. So it could have started with some sort of astral phenomena. Since these guys, the Zoroastrians, were astronomers and astrologers, They might have been looking for some sort of conjunction or something like that. But it would have had to have been something that was a rare event that would have gotten their attention, that this event had happened. But then the fact that it turned into this stellar guide, which first just brought them to Jerusalem, so it wasn't, precise enough to bring them to Bethlehem in the beginning. It was just brought them to Jerusalem. And I think God used this in order to start this frenzy that began with Herod and the Jewish scholars. But then after that is when the star became very precise, and it says it appeared over the house where Jesus was. So I don't know if there was like a light shining down from heaven or something, but somehow it directed them straight to this house. It was definitely miraculous and supernatural. So talking a little bit about the gifts of the Magi. Perhaps you've heard some of this already, but they brought gold and frankincense and myrrh. And it's because that there's three gifts that people have always envisioned three Magi. It doesn't actually give the number of Magi, but three gifts, three Magi, that makes sense. Who knows? We do know there were three gifts. Now, the Magi likely brought these expensive gifts because for them, it symbolized royalty, spirituality, and sacrifice in that order: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, the Jews would have seen them as symbolic as well, and they would have seen similarly with royalty, they would have associated gold with kingship. But more specifically than just spirituality, frankincense was burned at the temple. And so they would have associated frankincense with the priesthood. And then not just of sacrifice, but more specifically, they would have seen myrrh as an anointing. So myrrh was used to anoint the bodies for burial, and the Messiah was known as the Anointed One. And you would anoint kings. And myrrh was also a type of embalming fluid. So that would foreshadow Jesus' suffering and death on the cross. Oh, I should have put this up earlier. Here's the gifts of the Magi, and here's this funny cartoon. It says customers who bought this also bought frankincense and myrrh. I thought that was very funny. Here are the three Magi. So here are these different symbols of royalty, spirituality, and sacrifice. And then more specifically for the Jews, you have gold being kingship, frankincense being the priesthood. It talks about the frankincense being used in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14 through 16. And then this myrrh being the sacred anointing. All right, so next week we are going to talk about Christian things, but not Christmas things. We're going to talk about Easter things. We're going to talk about some things about Jesus' resurrection and the dates and times of that and the events surrounding it. So again, thanks for joining my channel today. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a great evening.